Lad mig starte med at slå fast, at der ikke bliver trykket på den røde knap i den 11. time i aften. Seere, der stod på i sidste uge, vil huske, at vi brugte den røde knap til at markere det morsomme. Det gjorde vi for at leve op til det besynderlige faktum, at den 11. time var blevet indstillet til en pris af tv-stationen TV2 Zulu som årets sjoveste tv-program. Nu må vi se realiteterne i øjnene. Den 11. time vandt ikke prisen for at være årets sjoveste tv-program, og nu sætter vi alvoren forrest og skubber morskaben til side. Min gæst i aften er en af Englands mest interessante yngre filosofer. Han er uddannet ved Cambridge i filosofi og teologi og kendt for at sige tingene, så de kan forstås. Vi skal tale om, hvad der er galt med verden i dag, og hvorfor de fleste af os er kede af det inderst inde, og hvad vi kan gøre ved det. Her kommer Phillip Blond. Good evening, Phillip.
Good evening.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
First off, let me start with asking you, are you or have you ever been a communist?
No, I would view myself as a conservative thinker.
I ask you this because you are known to be a sworn enemy of neoliberalism, and you have also argued that a true conservative must reject capitalism.
Yes, I think that the great error of, the last 50 years almost, is that conservatives think that they should believe in the free market. But the free market destroys almost all things. It destroys traditions, family life, societies, cultures, ways of doing things. The marketplace, as understood by contemporary neoliberalism, is something that no genuine conservatives should support or endorse.
But let's not move too fast ahead. Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you first to define neoliberalism. What is it really?
Well, neoliberalism really emerged on the scene at the end of the 1960s as an ideology. And it basically believes that, that since the state has failed and failed to provide economic growth, failed to foster prosperity, what needs to happen is that markets are the solution to virtually all of society's problems. It derives from the writings of Adam Smith and believes in what's called laissez-faire capitalism, the idea that markets should dominate and they are in essence the most efficient way to distribute resources across all societies.
But isn't that true? I mean, when you look at our world today, the idea and notion of free markets have triumphed everywhere. It's a bit like the Borg in Star Trek, resistance is futile. Everywhere you go, free markets are basically ruling. In China, it have pulled out, taken away maybe, I would say, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty.
Yes.
The communistic system broke down.
Sure.
The markets, the idea of free market is king today, isn't it?
Let's separate ideology from facts. If you look at all Western OECD nations as a whole, over the last 30 to 35 years, the average wage of workers has stagnated. Their share of income, of national income, has plummeted. Actually, if you're an ordinary waged worker, the best time for you was 45 to the 1970s. That's where the ordinary waged worker, whether middle class or working class, had the greatest share of prosperity and also stability. The modern, how can one put it, fashion, ideological desire for free markets has actually vastly empowered a very small group of people and a very small group of mega-rich companies at the expense of almost everybody else. Far from hugely engendering prosperity for everybody, I would argue that what the last 30 years or so of economic liberalisation has done is essentially impoverish people both economically, socially, culturally and spiritually.
So in your point of view, free markets and neoliberalism is dangerous. It's destroying the world as we know it.
Yes, I mean, we can begin sort of very simply. The point is that neoliberalism, as an understanding of markets, has eroded people's security. So on the one hand, we think that not only do we earn less than we have done 30 years ago. For instance, in the United States, the average man in his 30s earns 15% less than he did 30 years ago.
But if we talk about Denmark,
yes,
a lot of people have earned fortunes on a boom in real estate prices.
Sure.
They have been able to go to the bank
sure.
and borrow a lot
sure.
of money in the added value of their house.
Sure.
Isn't that the positive side of capitalism?
I think that's
and free markets.
Sure. What's actually happened? I think we need to separate the issues. The point is that who's benefited from neoliberalism depends on how much you've owned and where you're situated. There are a group of people who've benefited hugely, and they're the people who are able to speculate, to buy assets, and to benefit from the increase in asset price. But you and I, ordinary people, the most expensive asset they own is their own home. Now, what's actually happened, because real wages have essentially stagnated or fallen across the world, is that our house prices may have risen, but we've sold it to the bank. We've sold our rising equity in our houses to the bank. We've used debt to massively augment or increase our income. And we've also forced women of school-aged children into the workforce when they didn't necessarily want to go into. So what's actually happened, in spite of all the ideology around it, is we've mortgaged our own homes, our own economic security.
To make ends meet.
To make ends meet. We've taken on massive amounts of personal debt, and we've also increasingly eroded family life by forcing both mothers and fathers to go out to work. And so I would argue that actually we haven't seen the huge rises in prosperity that we're told we've experienced. We work longer hours for less wages and have taken on more debt, and more of us work. And this has had huge cost. The people who've benefited are the people at the very top. The vast majority of the middle and the working class haven't benefited, and the working class have actually suffered hugely disproportionately. And this is true across all of the developed nations. If you look at Britain, for example, Britain and the US, even though the examples I give, they're the ones that have been most subject to the free market. And it's very clear, if you look at Britain and the US, social mobility, which is the ability of the poorest people to go into the next class above,
to rise above
to rise above their own station, has declined massively. In Britain now, it's harder to move from your income level to the next income level than it was 30 years ago. Indeed, it's declined to levels before the Second World War. The same is true in the United States. So rather than capitalism in its free market form being prosperity for all, what's actually happened in the Anglo-Saxon world, and it is also happening in Europe as well, is that class divisions are becoming more entrenched. The poor really are getting poorer, and they really aren't allowed to share in the wealth that those at the top are creating.
How does this apply to the, how would you say it, the diseases of modern life? Status and anxiety, some people call it affluenza. How does this system affect, the way we feel inside and the way we are living with our family and so on?
Well, look, I mean, studies have shown that actually the thing that makes human beings most happy is permanence of human relationship. That's really stable, loving human relationships are what, as it were, fosters human happiness regardless. That's why when you go into the third world, people are always shocked at how happy people are. Why? Because they have stable human relationships. The sort of economic and social system we follow undermines stable human relationships. They've shown, for instance, studies have shown that the single most successful thing that cultures can do to make people more happy is to remove advertising. Advertising makes people deeply dissatisfied with their life, their achievements, their wife, their husband, their children, where they live. it undermines and erodes any sense of self-worth. And so we're now producing in the West a society of advertising and glamour, where we follow meaningless celebrities. But this isn't just accidental, this is fundamental to our economic system. Because making people who are essentially have nothing of any inherent worth in terms of what they've achieved, celebrities, undermines and erodes our own sense of self-worth and belief.
What about the family? How does neoliberalism and capitalism, how does it go along with the family?
Well, very simply, economically at first. Again, 30, 40 years ago, a single skilled manual labourer's wage was enough to provide for a family of 4. Now even 2 middle-class people working together all the hours God sends aren't enough to provide for a family of 2.
Because the wages haven't been rising?
The wages haven't been rising, inflation has been rising. For instance, since about 1970, across the developed world, wage rises have been below rates of inflation. So wages just cannot keep up with prices. So people have to work more, and because they have to work more, their social interaction is lessened. They don't have the children that they want to have, and if they do have the children, they're not able to look after them to the level that they want to. Studies have clearly shown that a large percentage of women want to stay with their children longer, don't necessarily want to go back to work, but they have to because the family themselves can't cope. And this has terrible consequences for Europe, because it means that Europeans are suffering all sorts of crises in they're not producing enough children to finance all of our pensions in later life, for example.
But on a more fundamental level,
sure.
Is capitalism against the? Does it go against the nature of or the idea of having a family?
Yes, it does. I mean, capital functions like this. Capitalism functions so as to destroy all forms of solidity. It functions so as to stimulate in us a persistent desire for something other. I mean, look at our sexual lives. We're increasingly interested in things that are ever more perverse or strange. And our economic lives, we're no longer satisfied with whatever we have. So what actually happens is capitalism essentially makes you unhappy with what you have. It disturbs your sense of desire. It introduces a permanent sense of anxiety and competition into your life. And in that sense, it distorts all human relationships and makes them, rather than ones of cooperation and mutual regard, ones of very aggressive forms of competition for resources that are meant to be more sort of available but are ever more scarce.
But wasn't the state in Western European countries at least supposed to be protecting us from the negative sides of capitalism?
This is the great story of the post-war years. What essentially happened is the European welfare state, as originally envisaged by the welfare statist left, thought that the welfare state would shelter ordinary people from capitalism and would protect them from the free market. What essentially happened, though, is that the welfare state disempowered working class people by taking away their ability to self-organise, by taking away their ability to work with each other. It atomised working class communities and also in some way prevented innovation. This then means that the left at the end of the 1960s abandoned the idea of a civic society and embraced the state as the sole representative. And this, as it were, is what allowed the state then to flip into supporting capitalism. So now we're in a situation where the left all across Europe, particularly in Britain, believes that the role of the state is to support capitalism, to at all stages let capitalism into the state, and the state always drives markets into local communities. So the state forces local economies to be open to globalization, which destroys local economies, destroys local businesses, and makes people more reliant on corporations.
Is this why, I wondered that more and more often these days you see heads of state in some sorts of unholy and weird corporations with big multinational companies. You have Schröder in Germany. He's working now for Gazprom.
Yes.
Tony Blair in Britain is a consultant for a large financial institution. Sarkozy is having his holidays together with French businessmen.
He is indeed.
Vladimir Putin is one of the wealthiest men in Europe.
Sure.
Is this a sign of what you're talking about?
Well, what's happened now, and I think
an unholy alliance between capitalism and the state?
What's actually happening now is capitalism needs the state to disempower ordinary people's institutions and lives. And what we're actually developing in, I think, now in modern Europe is a post-democratic society. We're creating an oligarchical elite structure where moneyed elites, the elites of industry, cohabit with political elites, and they move into each other's regimes and spaces. So we've now produced what I would call a market state. And the market state really just exists for the benefit of those at the top. And there's very clear economic and social evidence for this. It's very clear that only the top 1% or the top 5% of people in the developed world have really benefited from the last 30 years. So I would argue that what we're seeing is the rise of new oligarchies. It's almost as if the 19th century is returning to the 21st century, where we're going to live in a world where most of us are disempowered, most of us permanently struggle, most of us can't make ends meet, all for the benefit of a very small elite at the top, which is reaping vast rewards.
So we went from the 19th century to the 21st century, basically, in a way, skipping the 20th century.
Well, the golden age for most ordinary people was the first 25 years after the end of the Second World War. That's when, across the OECD, workers had the highest share of GDP. When that, as it were, ground to a halt and liberalisation set in the 70s, from there on has been a persistent downward pressure and erosion of the living standards of ordinary people. It's not noticed because they use debt, they use other family members to work, and they work more hours. But that's what's been going on.
But do you foresee the big crash in the States? We've had the so-called subprime crisis. People are talking about the real estate boom will collapse and so on. Do you foresee this, big cataclysm of the capitalistic system, as some are talking about? I would call there is a big crisis of monopoly capitalism, because what's going to happen is, and the subprime crisis in America has now clearly moved into middle-class homes. We've all survived by borrowing off each other. You think my house is going to be worth more. I think your house is going to be worth more. We remortgage our houses and sell to each other. And it's all fiction.
It's all fiction because, in a way, all value of things like that is fiction. Once we no longer are able to borrow because of the credit crunch, once we now realise that our wages won't cover the cost of these mortgages, all of these forces will go into reverse. So you can easily see compounded year-on-year 5% decreases in house prices. This actually is really dangerous for the whole of the developed Western world, because it means that people can no longer make ends meet in a very real way. As for those who really are wealthy, they will be fine, and they'll continue to be fine because they own the real commodities. They own
the oligarchs.
Gold. The oligarchs and the corporations own gold. They own orange futures, agricultural futures. They own land. They'll continue to be fine. They're not in any trouble, but we'll be in trouble.
What can we do, the citizens of the Western world, to fight this or to change the system?
Well, what I would argue is that what's actually happened in sort of the last 30 years is that both the state and the market have destroyed civil society, which is our world. And what we need to do is recover...
What is civil society exactly?
Civil society is something that's not the state or the market. Civil society is the world of you and I. But one story of what's happened is that ordinary people have been progressively disempowered by representative democracy no longer representing us, but only representing elites and selling that to us. So I would argue that we need roughly 5 major changes that we can bring about. First of all, we have to address asset ownership. In most European countries, and it varies, 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 even of us don't own. We don't own our own homes, and we don't own anything else. And it's very important that everybody owns. There shouldn't be a dispossessed class.
But that is, correct me if I'm wrong, that sounds like communism.
It's not communism because I don't believe in the state. I think the state is just another mechanism of disempowerment. I believe in markets, but I don't believe in capitalist markets. I believe in local civic markets. So, for instance, if everybody owned, and there wasn't just an exclusive dispossessed class, then, as it were, there wouldn't be a radically insecure bottom 20 or 30% of society that causes problems for everybody else. The second thing we need to do is, since wages are no longer enough, is all employees should have shares, should have some form of share ownership or some form of speculation in their own company.
So everybody should be a capitalist?
Yes, I mean, the point I would say is there's too much capital and too few capitalists. In a way that what we should do is, because the free market tends to monopoly, what we should do is try to restore the free market, try to restore a market where, as it were, people are more equal in its participation. And if, for instance, if everybody who's an employee owns shares, that's one of the biggest indicators of productivity for a company. Whereas at the moment, under neoliberalism, we give the CEOs share options, and it's a complete disaster. They falsely ramp up the value of the company to maximise their own returns and get out. The third thing we need to do, and this is really important, is we need to restore local economies. Corporations have destroyed all of our local ability to be self-sufficient. So another way of saying what's wrong with our lives is none of us are self-sufficient. Look at the food market in Britain. We used to be a nation of shopkeepers. And what it meant is we were a nation of a civic society. We're a self-sufficient people that sold things to each other and innovated. In Britain, in the food market, just 5 supermarket chains dominate. They've destroyed all of our town centres. They all look the same.
It's the same in Denmark.
The same in Denmark. They've destroyed local economies. What I love about France is when you get out of the metro, you walk home, and everybody's their own little shareholder. They have their own little business. Well, they make enough. They don't make that much, but they make enough. A much better life. But in countries, as you say, like your own...
But at the same time, French economy is going down the drain.
Well, the French economy is going down the drain precisely because that's what's happened is the state... this is the point. The state and the market are in a kind of alliance to produce neoliberalism. And the state, as it were, has destroyed innovation and investment for ordinary people by being too bureaucratic and too powerful. It actually stifles the development of small businesses into large businesses through very high rates of taxation. So what I want to suggest is exactly that needs to be recovered. So we need to get the state out of the local market and the corporations out of the local market. So that, for instance, let me give you a figure. In Britain, if you spend £1 in a supermarket, only 50p of that will circulate in your local economy. If you spend £1 in a local shop, £2 are generated for your local economy. And I believe in a society where everybody owns, everybody has a business or a stake in some way in that. And then that produces genuinely a shared world where there aren't people sectioned off.
But isn't that, some would say that is romanticism, that we need the output, the production output of mega-scale capitalism?
Again, not true. I mean, this is the ideology that sold us. Actually, if you look at rates of productivity for Britain and the US, they've been below France for 40 years. And yet France, they work less, and somehow they achieve more. What does France do? France has much more of a civil and civic economy. Same with Northern Italy. And it's exactly this that we need to foster. Oddly enough, local economies are more productive. For instance, they've shown that farmland in America that is farmed organically and in a small way without using mass machines. Because the mass machines they use for cereal cultivation destroy the soil. They smash it up and they destroy its structure. But the way, for instance, the Amish function, Amish fields are more productive than the mega fields producing owned by the multinational companies.
So we want to be like Amish French people.
We want to use modern technology so that we can, in some sense, restore variation and productivity to ordinary people.
Yes.
It remains true that ordinary people are entrepreneurs. Think of restaurants. We all know what a good restaurant is. We all know what a good cook is. And the market works very well in restaurants because we don't go to bad restaurants, we go to good ones. We can have this in all areas of our lives: food shopping, fashion, design, manufacture.
You also want religion back.
Yes, I mean, this is very interesting because modern capitalism destroys high culture. And most Marxists, and I'm not a Marxist, but most Marxists argue capitalism was inevitable, but it wasn't. Capitalism needed to destroy culture, and culture is always a patterning, a saying that we will do this, but we won't do this. So, for instance, the Christian injunction against slavery prevented trade in human beings. And it's always an ethical decision as to what you trade. Should we trade human organs? Should we trade babies? Should we trade cloned meat? Precisely recovering religion is recovering the idea of a shared cultural space within which we can talk about what's good for human beings and assert that sort of value system over against the economic and the state. So recovering religion is, in a way, recovering objectivity and debate around objectivity.
Yes. This, to me, sounds, your suggestions for fighting this development or for restoring civic society sounds radical, but at the same time you are a conservative.
Yes.
So in a way you are a radical conservative.
I think that I would call myself a red Tory in the sense that I'm a radical or a red insofar as I believe that the goods of the world should be shared amongst all members of the world, that all people are productive and all should benefit. So,
and actually, you're working on a book now called Red Tory or Red Conservative, which will be out next year.
Yes.
Mr. Blond, it's time for you to say goodnight to the viewers of the 11th hour, and you will use this camera.
Well, I'd like to say good night, and hopefully we're now looking at the twilight of the sort of capitalism that's been practiced for far too long, and also the end of the state that's disempowered so much. But what I'd like to say to the left liberals who think that sort of the world is the good world is that your soft left liberalism is part of what's destroyed a culture worth having and has produced the hard right. It's time for you to become more conservative, to talk about values that are objective and beyond choice and freedom, and in some sense rooted in a life worth having. And that's the debate you have to have if you want another sort of world.
Thank you.
Did you think that went well?
Are you pleased with yourself?
I had a wonderful time. I love this sort of conversation. I think
it was really high power talk.
And I thought you were really sort of asking very important questions. So I think it went. Well, I don't know. I can never tell.
Cheers.
Cheers. Did I manage to cover all the bases?
Yes.